Hey, everyone, settle in, dim the lights, maybe make some tea if you're the organized type. Tonight, we're wandering through medieval Europe, that charming era where hygiene was optional, politics was personal, and one person's overreaction could literally reshape centuries of custom. Our topic, the medieval things, banned forever because of one person. And yes, that means entire traditions wiped off the map just because a noble got offended, a monarch got scared, or a pope had a really bad afternoon. This isn't the story of political reform or noble principles. No, this is the story of someone waking up and saying, actually, I hate that thing, and somehow the rest of civilization agreeing. So, pull your blanket up. Let your brain settle into low-contrast mode, and let's drift back 1,000 years to where bans were unscientific, mostly personal, and occasionally hilarious. Let us begin with what might be history's most relatable scandal, when someone ruins everyone's fun because they simply can't handle it. Our first culprit, King Edward IV of England, a man who loved fashion so much, he managed to get dressing banned, because nothing ruins a good century like one man's insecurity in satin. Edward ruled during the 15th century, those cozy decades, when England was apparently allergic to peace. The Wars of the Roses were still making everyone's family tree look like a murder mystery. But amid that chaos, Edward had style. He was tall, handsome, allegedly, and so devoted to fine clothing that his court started to resemble a walking tapestry. Velvet, jewels, gold threads, perfumes, everything screamed, "I'm better than you," which, to be fair, was sort of the entire point of monarchy. But then came the problem. Everyone else started copying him. Merchants, minor nobles, even the kinds of people who only bathed when the moon was full began showing up in luxury fabrics. Because who doesn't want to feel royal, if only once before the bubonic plague gets you? Edward, naturally, was horrified. In his royal opinion, the kingdom was losing its aesthetic hierarchy. So, in 1463, he threw a royal tantrum that became the first of several sumptuary acts, also known as laws against looking fancy if you weren't born loud enough. These rules were detailed painfully so. If you weren't of noble blood, you couldn't wear gold, silver, velvet, satin, or fur. Even your spouse couldn't. Apparently, social climbing through accessorizing was the real threat to the crown. So yes, one man's ego gave medieval England its first national dress code, and it lasted for centuries. That's right. Fashion policing existed long before school principals started banning ripped jeans. Let's float gently forward a century or two, because the English weren't done banning things based on vibes. Now, meet one of history's least chill figures, Pope Urban II. You might know him as the man who launched the First Crusade in 1095. But before he sent everyone marching east, he also managed to ban something oddly specific. It wasn't wine, or dancing, or laughter. No, it was the crossbow. Why? Because it was too good. See, medieval nobles loved wars, where skill mattered, clashing knights, swords, dramatic speeches. But once the crossbow came along, a peasant could casually stroll up, press a trigger, and ruin a noble's whole bloodline. That didn't sit well with people whose entire status depended on being hard to kill. So Urban II issued a papal ban on crossbows against Christians. Killing non-Christians was, apparently, still fine. Selective morality. In the Middle Ages? Shocking. This didn't stop anyone. Of course, by the time Richard the Lionheart died from a crossbow bolt in 1199, every army in Europe had cheerfully ignored the papal decree for about a century. But the fact remains, one anxious churchman tried to ban advanced weaponry to preserve knightly glory. An entire continent collectively shrugged and kept shooting anyway. Next stop, France. Because if any medieval country turned banning stuff into an art form, it was the French court. Specifically, under King Charles VI, the one nicknamed Charles the Mad, not to be confused with the many other Charleses who struggled. Charles was known for thinking he was made of glass. Yashi believed that if someone touched him, he might shatter. The royal staff had to wrap him in blankets to keep him from breaking, which must have made hugging the king an extreme sport. During one of his clearer moments, or maybe not, Charles V decided to ban pointy shoesius, those long, noodle-like shoes that medieval men wore to compensate for. Well, we can guess the shoes had become absurdly long, sometimes curling several inches beyond the toe. Nobles used wire to keep them stiff. One chronicle claimed some men had shoes so long they tied them to their knees with chains just to walk. Apparently, Charles saw this and thought, enough. These people are ridiculous, and also maybe I'm glass. And so, in 1368, poulain shoes were banned for moral corruption. Which, if you ask me, sounds like the most medieval reason possible. Not vanity, not comfort. Moral corruption. The church agreed, because it agreed with anything that sounded disapproving. Naturally, the ban failed, because fashion always wins. But for a few gloriously weird years, France actually legislated footwear ethics. Let's drift a bit north to Norway. Around the 1200s, King Magnus Sixto, called Magnus the Lawman, because subtlety wasn't a thing, decided one folk tradition was getting out of hand. Bear wrestling at weddings. Apparently, it was customary for guests to bring a bear cub to the wedding, raise it semi-domesticated, and then, as a finale, pit men against it for entertainment. Imagine your uncle getting mauled in the name of love. Magnus, who wasn't exactly a party animal, banned the practice outright. His reasoning wasn't out of compassion for the bears. Mind you, he just thought too many noblemen were dying in socially awkward ways. Few things ruin a celebration like your best man being eaten before dessert. Historians note that this single royal decree ended a centuries-old tradition of beast entertainment, turning Norway into one of the first European kingdoms to effectively ban animal cruelty by accident, which, frankly, feels on brand for the medieval period, and because every good bedtime story deserves an absurd royal twist. All right, let's settle back in. If Part 1 gave us kings banning clothes and popes banning weaponry, Part 2 is where medieval Europe turns its moral microscope on things that were, frankly, too fun to survive. Yes, food, festivals, and dancing. 3 things pretty much guaranteed to offend someone powerful enough to outlaw joy. Let's glide gently into France again, the birthplace of beauty, cuisine, and passa. Our first culprit tonight is none other than King Louis IX. St. Louis, the holy reformer turned party poop. Louis X ruled in the mid-1200s and spent most of his reign trying to make France so pure it would squeak when it walked, which is noble in theory, until you realize his definition of purity included banning people from eating eels. Yes, eels. Those slippery river-dwellers that, for centuries, were medieval Europe's seafood of choice. Logic. Simply, Einuch. During Lent, no meat allowed, so everyone turned to fish. But the church hierarchy started worrying that eels were too rich and too indulgent. Apparently, the Lord could forgive many things but not buttery freshwater luxury. Louis, naturally, declared a royal ban on gluttonous fish, specifically eels prepared in wine or butter, because holiness, apparently, required suffering through bad seasoning. The ban spread across French monasteries, where monks reluctantly replaced their eel stews with barley and turnips. Somewhere out there in 1265, a chef quietly wept into his empty pot. Let's drift south toward Italy, because no historical bedtime story is complete without some dramatic popes ruining culinary innovation. Meet Pope Gregory IX. Devout, stubborn, and strangely enough the man responsible for nearly banning cats. Around 1230, Gregory declared cats to be instruments of Satan. Why? Because certain heretical groups, allegedly, used black cats in rituals. So, naturally, he ordered mass exterminations of cats across Christian Europe. What could possibly go wrong? You can almost hear the future historians fit, because, in one of those haunting coincidences, not long after that cat purge, the population of disease-carrying rats exploded. Within a century, the Black Death would arrive. To be fair, Gregory didn't single-handedly cause the plague, but his anti-cat crusade certainly didn't help. All because one man, probably spooked by a meowing shadow during a sermon, decided felines were unholy. As a result, an entire continent's favorite rodent control system vanished almost overnight, the medieval version of Delete System 32. From the Vatican, we'll float up the Alps to Switzerland. Around the 14th century, imagine a village tucked between lakes and mountains, full of cold cheese, colder people, and occasional yodeling. The locals had a lively spring festival called the Night of the Cowbells, where they ran through the streets, ringing bells, singing crude songs, and occasionally stealing each other's goats. Enter Count Rudolph of Habsburg, a man who disliked noise almost as much as he disliked joy. According to local chronicles, Rudolph had suffered a migraine during one of these festivals. By morning, he issued a local edict banning all-night festivals involving cowbells, chanting, or excessive merriment. And because the Habsburgs were basically Europe's microphone, the ban spread through their territories. For generations afterward, Alpine celebrations had to end before sundown. One nobleman's headache permanently reshaped Swiss nightlife. You can almost picture him groaning into a silk pillow, muttering, "Never again," while peasants quietly stored away their bells. Now, speaking of noblemen turning personal inconveniences into national law, let's float toward England again for one of the stranger culinary bans in history. The outlawing of pie. Yes, spy. The comfort food of peasants and kings alike. King Henry VIII allegedly banned certain types of meat pies after learning that people were smuggling gold and letters inside them. Nothing like a spycraft scandal to ruin dessert. The ban began as a royal investigation and somehow ended with new kitchen regulations, preventing concealment within pastry. Because medieval bureaucracy could make anything ridiculous, 4 years afterward, bakers were forced to keep their pie crusts open-faced, like edible windows of shame. Outlawed enclosed pies. Allowed sadness. It wasn't until Elizabeth I's reign that fully sealed pies made a comeback because she liked surprises. Yes, an entire culinary form disappeared simply because someone couldn't handle edible secrets. Let's quietly cross over to Spain in the 15th century now, where King Ferdinand II decided that dancing was dangerous. You'd think wars and conquests would be his big concern, but no. Ferdinand was apparently haunted by a scandal involving court dances that brought sin into motion. AAD attended a feast where noblemen and ladies performed a new, daring dance with, wait for it, hand-touching. Scandalous. The king was allegedly so uncomfortable that he banned public dancing altogether in several Spanish provinces. In his edict, he wrote that kisses in rhythm are the devil's invention. Centuries later, Spain would famously invent flamenco, the most passionate rhythmic dance on earth. Honestly, that's history's version of poetic revenge. Speaking of bad optics, let's slide back to France once more, because no one banned things quite as elegantly as they did. In 1314, Queen Joan II decided that garlic breath was unfit for courtly women. She reportedly caught one lady at a banquet exhaling in her direction and nearly fainted. Within a week, garlic was banned from meals served at the royal court of Navarre. Violators could be exiled from attending feasts for a whole year. The official reason was to maintain spiritual cleanliness, because obviously nothing says holiness like pretending you don't eat. Historians now cite this as one of the earliest examples of social odor regulation. So next time your friend chews a mint before a date, thank Queen Joan and her overdramatic nose. Let's float gently east to Hungary, place where ban logic hits surreal levels. King Matthias Corvinus, one of Europe's most educated rulers, loved books, wine, and order, but he hated one thing: soup served cold. According to court records from the 1470s, Matthias banned chilled soups altogether after tasting a lukewarm broth at a banquet and declaring it an offense to the stomach and soul. So yes, gazpacho was a criminal act. In medieval Hungary, cooks were required to serve every soup steaming. No excuses. Imagine generations of terrified chefs hovering over boiling pots out of fear of disappointing a monarch's delicate palate. Even centuries later, Hungarian cookbooks still warned that the dish must be heated in honor of the king. Talk about lasting impact. By this point in the story, you might notice a pattern. Medieval leaders didn't ban things for moral or social progress. They banned things for vibes, boredom, superstition, or poor personal experiences. If something annoyed them once, it disappeared for decades. And these bans weren't just strange. They were contagious. One monarch's irritation could ripple across continents. You could wake up one morning and discover your favorite cheese, song, or footwear was now considered sinful. But what's fascinating if you squinted it through the haze of history is how emotional it all was. Medieval bans are basically the first recorded temper tantrums that got written into law. In the next stretch, we'll drift further into the stranger, quieter corners of medieval culture rituals. Bats, laughter, mirrors each outlawed somewhere, sometime, all because someone couldn't handle them. Let's stay cozy and follow the bans into the private world of medieval belief and self-image, where vanity, fear, and superstition laid down the weirdest laws ever written. Welcome, Bucknight Wanderer. You've survived medieval bans on food and fun. So naturally, our next stop is the human body. Because at some point, Europe collectively decided that the problem wasn't war, or famine, or bad kings. It was people enjoying being alive. So, pull the blanket tighter. Maybe sip that lukewarm tebby. 'Cause we're gliding into an era where people ban things like mirrors, baths, and laughter. All thanks to someone's fragile ego or a badly timed superstition. Let's begin with something truly poetic. When a queen banned asterisk, mirrors, asterisk, Eleanor of Aquitaine gets all the fame for her power in politics, but tucked away in the 12th century, Queen Isabella of Francoffen, nicknamed the She-Wolf, had her own little moment of dramatic self. During a stretch of court troubles, she reportedly declared that mirrors invite vanity and falsehood. The actual reason, gossip suggests, was less philosophical. She was in her 30s, medieval skincare was non-existent, and she didn't want to see a reflection during a particularly stressful patch of marriage to Edward II. Mirrors were quietly removed from the royal quarters for a time. Sarcastically enough, a king famous for ignoring his wife ended up with a court that banned noticing her face. Other noblewomen followed her lead, calling mirrors tools of sin. When a custom spreads because of one woman's bad day, you know it's medieval Europe. By the late 1300s, theologians genuinely classified mirrors as temptations of pride. Glassmakers lost business. Monks wrote pamphlets about reflective deception, and all because one moody queen didn't want to look in one. Next, let's float east to Bohemia. The year is around 1395, and King Wenceslas IV, the one who makes Christmas songs awkward, was having a rough reign. He loved wine, hated discipline, and fought with absolutely everyone, including the Holy Roman Emperor, who happened to be his brother. It's said that after one particularly heated argument, Wenceslas decided the real problem with his court politics was people smiling too much while gossiping. So he banned asterisk, laughter, during official council sessions, calling it disrespectful and satanic levity. This was less moral decree, more thin-skinned rage disguised as good governance. His courtiers tried to obey. But enduring multi-hour councils with straight faces apparently drove several into coughing fits from suppressed giggles. Chroniclers noted, with obvious delight, that the laughter ban had the opposite effect. Wenceslas soon relapsed into old habits, drinking, arguing, and probably laughing anyway. The decree quietly disappeared, but for a brief moment, Bohemia had statin force solemnity. Because one king couldn't take a joke. Now, let's slide into something even stranger. When bathing became suspicious, you've heard the myths. People in the Middle Ages rarely bathed. That's only half true. For much of the 12th and 13th centuries, public bathhouses were surprisingly popular. Couples went there on dates. People conducted business in warm pools, and monks sometimes slipped in for relaxation under the excuse of health. Enter a new voice of doom. Henry of Lausanne, a fanatical preacher who toured France in the 1100s. He decided that public bathing led to unholy thoughts, nakedness, warmth, conversation, clearly Satan's trap. After one sermon in Toulouse, he convinced the local lords to close bathhouses entirely. The idea spread fast. Within decades, many towns followed suit, citing virtue. This single man's anti-bath crusade slowly infiltrated the mindset of medieval Europe. By the 1300s, what began as hygiene turned into heresy. Entire cities banned mixed bathing. Many banned bathing altogether, and by the time of the Black Death, people genuinely believed washing opened the pores to disease. So, yes, one angry preacher contributed, indirectly, 2 centuries of unwashed nobility. There are consequences to moral panic, and sometimes they smell bad. Drifting north now to Scotland, the land of cold weather, and even colder royal temperaments. Around the late 1400s, King James III found himself plagued by jealousy, not of other kings or armies, but of his own musicians. James loved music deeply, fancying himself a sort of artistic monarch. But apparently, one minstrel got a little too popular at court. Rumors claim that after overhearing courtiers praise the musician singing more than his royal skills, James promptly banned the playing of certain instruments in his presence, particularly asterisk. The lyre, asterisk. Yes, the medieval equivalent of cancelling someone because they sang better than you at karaoke. For years, poets in Scotland complained that the royal court had turned eerily silent, polite applause replaced by uncomfortable coughs. Only after his death did the ban fully vanish. And it is said the first sound that filled the court that day was a lute chord played in defiance. From silent courts to haircuts, because, of course, someone managed to outlaw those two. In the early 12th century, Holy Roman Emperor Henry V decided long hair was a sign of decadence. Legend has it he walked into a cathedral one morning, saw a line of elaborately styled courtiers, and snapped. Within days, he'd decreed mandatory short hair for all men in imperial service. Historians chalk it up to simple jealousies. Henry had been balding prematurely, and, instead of buying a nice hat, like most people, he chose legislation. The hair order sparked silent rebellion. Nobles began wearing wigs made from horsehair, while barbers quietly made a fortune convincing clients their trims were technically above the ear. Eventually, the policy fizzled, but medieval Europe's weird preoccupation with hair never quite died. Years later, monks and clergy adopted shaved heads as symbols of humility. Another ripple from one emperor's bad hair day. Now, let's drift to the quieter, stranger corners of medieval religion, where bans stopped being about appearance and started targeting emotion itself. In certain monastic orders during the 1200s, abbots began forbidding asterisk private prayer asterisk. It sounds odd, but it came from one abbot's paranoia over individuality. Brother Anselm of Cluny allegedly declared that monks praying alone risked wandering thoughts, so he banned solo devotion, insisting all prayer must occur in strict group formation. One man's fear of daydreaming turned into a rule against solitude. For decades, the idea spread across monasteries. Solitude, once seen as sacred, became suspect. You can almost feel the irony: people devoting their lives to spiritual reflection, forbidden from thinking by themselves. And here's one more both petty and poetic. Queen Margaret of Denmark in the 14th century had a recurring headache disorder. Doctors of the day didn't exactly have aspirin, so they prescribed peace and silence. Problem was, her servants kept clanging the bells that announced her arrival in public processions. So, she banned bells entirely. For 3 years, The Danish court went bell. Churches were instructed to lower their chimes during royal visits, and courtiers replaced sound with silent nods. One chronicler even complained that the kingdom forgot its hour, since bells marked not only worship, but timekeeping. When Margaret's condition improved, the bells returned. But even centuries later, a Danish proverb lingered. Silence for the Queen. Proof that temporary decrees can echo longer than intended. By now, it's becoming clear that the medieval world ran on a strange rhythm of personal discomfort elevated into cosmic significance. If something upset a ruler's senses, it vanished. If something amused the wrong people, it was If something reflected too honestly, it was sin. And the result? A world of quiet halls, dull meals, and societies wrapped in rules no one remembered the reason for. Almost poetic. Really a civilization constantly banning itself in the name of order. Let's drift a little longer, because beyond the baths and mirrors, there were stranger bans. Still the ones aimed at nature itself. Birds, animals, even weather rituals banned, because one powerful person just didn't like what they saw. Welcome back, traveler. You've made it through banned laughter, baths, and music so. Naturally, the only way left is down the rabbit hole of superstition. Tonight's question: what happens when kings, emperors, and popes turn their frustrations toward the natural world? Short answer: they start banning animals for being inconvenient. Long answer: let's take a slow walk through the absurd. Let's begin with England again, which never disappoints in the creative overreaction department. Around the late 1200s, King Edward also, known as Longshanks, professional grudge holder and occasional that ravens were a sinister. Apparently, one day he visited the Tower of London and claimed that the croaking of ravens at dawn had ruined his sleep. Week royal falconers were ordered to remove them. The ravens, mind you, had lived there for centuries, nested in the towers, and even fed on battle leftovers. But Edward's royal hangover took precedence over ecology. The irony, of course, is delicious. Centuries later, a superstition arose that asterisk if the ravens ever leave the tower, the crown will fall. Asterisk. So, the descendants of Edward's least favorite birds became the symbolic guardians of the monarchy. History does love a slow clap. Next, glide gently across the channel into medieval France again, because nothing says balance like French nobles suing frogs. Yes, literally. Around 1386, a French abbey near Dijon became famous for its ponds full of frogs that croaked so loudly the monks couldn't sleep. The abbot, fed up, appealed to the local bishop. Instead of relocating the frogs like normal people, the bishop staged an ecclesiastical trial against them. The frogs were declared guilty of disturbing divine peace and sentenced to banishment. Monks were dispatched with buckets to escort them out. The record proudly notes that the sentence was justly executed. Somewhere out there, a group of medieval clerics genuinely believed they had legally exiled amphibians. All because one man didn't like their lullaby. And yes, this wasn't a one-time event. Similar trials were held across Europe. Pigs, beetles, grasshoppers all summoned to church courts, because human pettiness has ancient roots. Speaking of animals in court, let's drift to Switzerland. Around the 1470s, when a village in the canton of Vaud put a group of slugs on trial. Their crime: eating too much cabbage. The local judge, who had no sense of proportion, ordered the priest to read a decree, giving the slugs 3 days to vacate the fields or be The slugs obviously didn't comply. The official verdict recorded their punishment in absentia. Some say the crops recovered, some say the villagers just stopped listening to the clergy. Either way, the moral is clear: when something on 4 legs frustrated a medieval person, their first instinct was to make it illegal. Let's slide south now, to medieval Italy, where even the weather itself wasn't safe. During the papacy of Innocent VIII in the late 1400s, parts of northern Italy experienced a string of devastating hailstorms. instead of consulting meteorologists, a profession that technically didn't exist yet. Innocent decided which were responsible. His solution? Ban wither manipulation. This decree laid the groundwork for centuries of witch hunts across Europe. What began as one man's bad harvest season turned into paranoia codified by law. Every storm, every flood, every crop failure became evidence. And all because a pope couldn't accept bad luck without drafting policy. Worse, this ban inspired regional laws in Switzerland and Germany. Local courts began prosecuting weather spells, rain dances, and even songs sung by shepherds, which means singing in the rain was an actual crime for a while. Now, let's wander north to Scandinavia, where kings took everything personally, including the weather. King Olaf IV of Norway, late 1300s, reportedly banned wind spells after several fishermen accused sea witches of calming storms for rival towns. Olaf decided this unbalanced divine justice. For about a decade, it became illegal to whistle at sea or perform wind gestures on boats. The result? Absolute silence on Norse ships. Sailors, who'd spent centuries whistling to pass time, suddenly had to communicate by gestures. Some chroniclers note that supposed calm seas often occurred precisely when the ban was enforced, proving that superstition sometimes worked by accident. Let's cross to Hungary again, because they always had flair for absurd grace. In the 15th century, King Ladislas V reportedly banned *** storks nesting on church roofs. *** storks, in medieval folklore, symbolized rebirth and divine protection. But apparently, one nesting pair dropped debris on a royal carriage during a procession. In full regal fury, Ladislas declared, "God does not need birds on his house." Entire towns rushed to remove stork nests, terrified of royal punishment. The ban remained in force for years, until peasants began secretly rebuilding the nests, saying the villages felt unlucky without them. Eventually, the superstition flipped against storks became good luck, and killing one was declared a crime. Medieval Europe had a unique talent for turning every problem into its opposite. Floating softly now to Bavaria, around 1510, technically late medieval, but we'll let it pass, since this one's too weird to skip. A count named Eberhard of Württemberg ban * moonlight gatherings, * after catching local girls dancing outside on full moon nights. Allegedly, one of them refused his advances, and he later announced that the entire ritual was a danger to Christian modesty. So he outlawed moonlight dances altogether. The punishment, public confession, and cleaning the church floors. Poetic justice, if nothing else. Ironically, the ban spread across several German towns, an early example of how personal rejection could become canon law. For decades, full moon nights in parts of Europe were eerily quiet, all because one man's ego bruised under the stars. And we'd be remiss not to visit the charming chaos of medieval Italy again, where the city of Modena banned **owls**. Yes, owls. Apparently, Duke Obizo III woke one night to the hooting of one perched on his window, considered an omen of death. The very next morning, he ordered every owl in the city removed. Chroniclers note, the Duke later died within a year, proving, at least in the medieval imagination, that the birds had been right all along. The irony of punishing nature for predicting human fragility never seemed to register. If all this seems ridiculous, it's because it is. Yet, beneath the absurdity sits something oddly human. Medieval rulers were trying, in their own panicked way, to control the uncontrollable. In a world without science, a frog chorus sounded like mockery. A storm looked like judgment. An owl became doom itself. In each time, the solution was the same. Ban it. Erase it. Silence it. All right, we've glided through kings banning clothes, queens banning garlic, popes banning weather, and dukes banning frogs. Now it's time to drift into the quietest, strangest place of all, the human mind. Because eventually, after running out of foods, animals, and hobbies, to outlaw medieval rulers began banning thoughts, imagination, color, music, books if it could stir a feeling. Someone somewhere decided it was dangerous. Let's start gently. In Paris, around the late 1200s, at the University of Paris, a hub of intellect and the birthplace of some truly confused censorship. Back then, scholars had just rediscovered Aristotle. His works were spreading like wildfire, filling dusty monasteries with radical ideas such as logic, observation, and reason. You know, all the fun stuff. But then along came Bishop Etienne Tempier in 1277, who woke up one cold February and decided enough was enough. Philosophy, he declared, was breeding arrogance. Students were asking questions like, does God obey natural law? And that, to him, sounded dangerously smart. So, with a flourish of holy ink, he banned 219 specific ideas from being taught. Literally, a list. No questioning divine miracles, no saying the earth might move, no suggesting reason had limits. It was, in a sense, the first recorded academic crackdown born from one man's headache. Ironically, historians say this ban pushed scholars to find loopholes and question even more, so Tempier tried to silence free thought and accidentally gave it fuel. The universe has a sense of humor. Now, let's float south to Florence, Italy, where censorship decided fashion wasn't enough. It wanted poetry. To meet Girolamo Savonarola, the 15th century friar, who looked at Renaissance Florence's art, music, and well-thumbed thought, absolutely not. He denounced beauty as sin, paintings as vanity, and songs as seduction. And one evening in 1497, he organized a little event called the Bonfire of the Vanities. People marched through Florence, tossing paintings, books, cosmetics, lutes, even mirrors into a huge fire. It was a moral purification party, sponsored by one man's crisis of faith. For a while, it worked. Artists hid their sketches, libraries went dark, households burned perfume bottles like confessions. But then Florence realized life without color and music felt suspiciously like death. Savonarola soon got his own taste of fire, courtesy of political enemies, and ironically became a martyr for the same drama he created. History really loves circular endings. Meanwhile, up in England, something quieter was burning. In the early 1400s, a scholar named John Wycliffe dared to translate the Bible into English, so regular people could read it. Logical, right? Well, not to the clergy. They liked being the only ones with access to heaven's script. After Wycliffe's death, church authorities got even pettier. They banned his translation, exhumed his body, and burned his bones, just to make a point. For decades, it was illegal to even own asterisk an English Bible. This wasn't about religion anymore, it was about control of language. The idea that truth might exist outside Latin terrified bishops more than any demon ever could. And, thanks to that fear, literacy itself became rebellious. Now let's take a soft detour to Spain, where the crown decided color not words was the real threat. Queen Isabella, the same one who sent Columbus off to get lost across the Atlantic, had the color purple officially restricted to royalty in 1490. Her reasoning, too majestic for common souls. Purple dye was expensive, sure, but this wasn't just economic snobbery. Isabella had seen lower nobles wearing violet robes at a feast and disliked, apparently, how good they looked. Wheat-in-Mont's proclamations forbade anyone below certain rank from wearing the shade. And just like that, color became class. One personal dislike, immortalized in law. Even after her death, Spanish fashion clung to drab grays and blacks as a sign of holiness. Centuries would pass before ordinary people dared to look royal again. Let's move quietly into Germany, where suspicion fell upon sound itself. During the reign of Emperor Maximilian I, the church choir in Augsburg became unexpectedly famous for new harmonies, rich, layered, emotional music that made people cry en masse. Beautiful? Yes, but not according to the older clergy. One particularly humorless bishop accused the choirmaster of making sin through sound and banned all polyphony multiple voices singing at once. The reasoning. 2. Sensual. This single bishop's complaint spread through the Holy Roman Empire, freezing church music for nearly a century. Composers either obeyed or went underground, quietly writing harmonies by candlelight. Imagine silencing beauty itself because someone found it distracting. That, in essence, was medieval leadership summarized. Now, drifting even more gently, we find the absurd border between religion and rumor. The year is roughly 1380. In Prague, a local baron named Oldrich C. Rasperka had a recurring dream of a black dog entering his castle. Superstitious to the core, he issued an official edict against keeping black dogs inside city walls. Ekaded thim, Satan's messengers. Within weeks, every noble household sent their dark-colored hounds away. Dog breeders were forced to either dye the animals lighter using flour, no less, or euthanize them. You can almost see the hypocrisy. Medieval courts full of power and politics, terrified of what shade their pets happened to be. Later, chroniclers mocked Oldrich as the dog-ban baron, though his superstition lingered for generations. Long before anyone burned witches, someone banished Labradors. Across the Channel, Scotland had its own obsession-banning prophecy. King James I of Scotland grew up hearing tales of doom foretold by seers, one of which predicted his assassination. You can guess how that ended. After narrowly escaping a rebellion, he outlawed foretelling of events, dreams, or fortunes. Ironically, the prophecy proved right. James was later murdered, confirming once again that medieval bans had the same accuracy as medieval medicine. Still, fortune-telling became taboo for centuries thereafter, all because one nervous king thought banning words could rewrite fate. Antinteris, the last great sweep of censorship before the Renaissance dawned, the banning of laughter in monasteries. Around the late 1400s, strict Benedictine reforms began circulating through Europe's monasteries, led by a monk named Johannes. He sincerely believed laughter distracted from God, and claimed that the devil enters the soul through jest. Naturally, abbots loved the idea. Silence became a rule of holiness. Some abbeys even built penitent cells for monks caught giggling during meals. Imagine being jailed for finding bread funny. It's telling that the Renaissance, an entire cultural explosion of art and wit, began just as these rules finally loosened. After centuries of quiet, Europe collectively decided that maybe joy wasn't demonic after all. So there we have it. Across 5 long, candlelit centuries, humanity managed to outlaw nearly everything that made life bearable. Bright colors, bathing, laughter, music, books, and the pattern is almost gentle now in its absurdity. One person's discomfort would ripple outward until generations forgot why the rule existed. Sometimes, the ban outlived its author. Sometimes, it reversed itself, like ravens turning from nuisance to guardians. But always, it began the same way, with someone important saying, "I don't like that," and everyone nodding. That's the quiet poetry of the Middle Ages. A civilization so fragile that even sound, scent, or joy could be legislated away. Yet, remarkably, people kept painting, singing, laughing, and dreaming anyway. You can suppress humanity's habits, but not its heart. And so, as candles burn lower and the castles fade from view, this is where we leave medieval Europe. No more decrees, no more cries of outrage about frogs or fabrics. The bans have settled into dust, just like the rulers who wrote them. If there's any lesson left in their ashes, it's this: power fears laughter more than rebellion, mirrors more than swords, and ideas most of all. Sleep easy, traveler. The bans are gone. The night is quiet, and history, for once, has nothing left to forbid. Now we're talking about Sparta, not the part with screaming men in red cloaks. We're talking about the quiet half. The half history textbooks usually skip the Spartan girls, They didn't train like other Greek women, didn't dress like them, and definitely didn't think like them. In a world where most women learned how to spin wool, Spartan girls were learning how to throw javelins, wrestle, and make the rest of Greece extremely uncomfortable. So, pull up the blanket. We're not charging into battle. We're drifting into a dusty courtyard, somewhere around the 6th century BC, where a 10-year-old girl is jogging barefoot across hard earth and calling that childhood. It's tempting to see Sparta as one big gym membership with citizenship benefits. But for the girls, it was stranger than that. Their lives revolved around paradoxes. Total control disguised as freedom, obedience wrapped in empowerment. From birth, their education began just like the boys, with judgment. Spartan infants were inspected by a council of elders, because obviously nothing says parental love like a state-sponsored body check. Weak babies, regardless of gender, were often left to die in the wild. Strength wasn't optional. It was national policy. If a girl survived, congratulations, she was officially too sturdy to kill. Her future was government property. By the age of 7, Spartan girls entered the Agi not as soldiers, but as something arguably trickier, future mothers of soldiers. The city believed that strong women made strong babies, which makes sense if you squint. Or if you live in a perpetual military economy that really wants every uterus on the payroll. Their daily routine included running, discus, throwing, horse riding, and mock fights. Nothing too brutal. Just the light, everyday humiliation of wrestling your peers in public while old men judged your posture. And yes, Spartan girls trained mostly nude at least according to ancient sources, who seemed both scandalized and fascinated. The idea was practical. Clothing got in the way of movement. The result? Half of Greece told scandalous gossip for centuries. Let's float over to Athens for contrast. There, a good woman stayed indoors. Unseen, ideally unheard. Her world confined to weaving and whispering. Athenian men looked at Spartan women and called them shameful. Spartans looked back and called them weak. It's basically the ancient Greek version of an internet comment section, only with more togas and fewer emojis. But this female athleticism wasn't random. It was political. Lycurgus, the possibly mythical lawgiver of Sparta, supposedly argued that women should strengthen their bodies to produce healthy offspring. And in an economy built entirely on war, reproduction was defense policy. So every sprint, every wrestling match, every victory in the field wasn't personal, it was patriotic. Raising daughters became a state project. Even their competitions had national flavor. One festival, the Hyaen, featured races where girls competed in tiers according to age. Winners received olive garlands, losers got the usual prize of collective embarrassment. Ancient poets recorded the songs they sang celebrating strength, mocking weakness. Imagine a girl's chorus somewhere between a hymn and a locker room chant. Public confidence was expected. Spartan girls spoke directly to men, something virtually unthinkable elsewhere in Greece. Foreign visitors noted their sharp tongues. Aristotle, never short of disapproval, blamed them for Sparta's eventual decline. He believed women had too much influence, and coming from Aristotle, that was practically a badge of honor. Archaeological finds back this up. Gravestones dedicated to women mention achievements in athletics, not decorum. That alone tells you everything about Spartan priorities. Let's drift toward the domestic side, if you can call it that. Spartan marriages were unconventional, to put it generously. Girls, typically married around 18 in ancient Greece, considered that mature and often two men already serving in the army. The wedding ceremony. A performance of kidnapping. A Spartan bride was shaved bald, dressed in a man's cloak, left alone in a dark room, and carried off by her husband, in the night, consensually in theory, ritualistically in tone. It symbolized the fusion of warrior and household. Romantic. If your idea of romance includes abduction and hair clippers, even marriage, though, was filtered through duty. Husbands lived mostly in barracks, wives ran the estates, and here sits the odd twist. Spartan women controlled land, property, and servants, while their men trained or fought. By the 4th century BC, scholars estimated women owned nearly 40% of Spartan property, a staggeringly modern figure hidden in a deeply unmodern society. They couldn't vote, but they could literally own the farm. Control through caretaking, power through absence, that was the quiet genius of the Spartan system. Let's float for a moment to daily life. A Spartan girl's homework might include physical drills, choral songs praising courage, and mock arguments designed to sharpen wit. Laziness was treated almost like treason. Meals were communal, simple, and famously disgusting. The local black broth was a mix of blood, vinegar, and despair. But there's something fascinating underneath the grime. Unlike elsewhere in Greece, Spartan girls grew up knowing their worth. Not emotional worth, physical, civic, biological worth. Sparta didn't flatter females. It depended on them. That sense of identity bred confidence so terrifying to outsiders that centuries of Greek literature painted them as unladylike monsters, which, to be fair, they sort of were if your standard of womanhood involved silence. By adolescence, they practiced dancing for festivals, resource management for estates, and archery purely to build endurance. Older women led choirs that praised the dead and encouraged the living. Girls were told to mock cowardice. During war, mothers told sons to return with their shield or on it. No motherly hugs, just Spartan efficiency, wrapped in consequence. Still, this harsh tenderness created loyalty, fierce enough to sustain Sparta's army for centuries. Every soldier was, after all, born from a woman, trained to be fearless in everything except mediocrity. Let's drift briefly to the modern echo. For generations, historians misread this culture as early feminism. It wasn't. It was militarism with cardio. But inside that machine, Spartan women found rare breathing room. Education, visibility, property, pride. Sometimes power hides inside obedience. Sparta just perfected the disguise. Welcome, bike. Let's stretch, wiggle the toes a little, and settle in again. Weary gliding deeper into Sparta now, beyond the training yards and the dusty songs, into the grown-up world of those same girls once they become women. Sparta, contrary to its cinematic reputation, did not live on constant battle cries. Most of the time it lived on routine built, in no small part, by the women. When a Spartan girl reached adulthood, she didn't vanish into domestic shadows like women elsewhere in Greece. No spinning rooms, no locked quarters, no husbands dictating wardrobe choices. In fact, many husbands barely came home at all. They were in the barracks, living the state's version of a forever camping trip. So, who ran Sparta? You guessed it, the wives, the mothers, the sisters, the entire female backbone that kept the supply lines of civilization from collapsing, while every male between 17 and 60 was off testing his spear posture. Ancient travelers like Xenophon and Plutarch quietly admitted that the men fought, but the women ruled. Rule might be too strong a word. Managed everything without being thanked is more accurate. Imagine a typical day. A Spartan woman supervising Helot laborers, measuring grain harvests, negotiating with merchants, maybe jogging beside her children just to remind them she still runs faster than they do. She spoke bluntly, never using two words where an insult would do. When a visitor from Athens once told a Spartan woman that her influence made men obey, she supposedly replied, "Yes, because we are the mothers of men." It's a humble brag wrapped in state propaganda, and it worked beautifully. Mariahain, Sparta, strange as it began, eventually settled into its own rhythm. Husbands might sneak away from barracks for visits, quiet, quick, disciplined. The idea was to keep relationships intense, but not distracting. Even romance was military training. Over time, with husbands largely absent, property ownership shifted. Women inherited, invested, lent money. They managed estates worth fortunes, and sometimes even paid penalties for soldiers who deserted. If your husband failed the test of bravery, you, too, bore the social price. Shame, in Sparta, was practically a form of taxation. Let's float to the woman who became the symbol of that paradox. Queen Gorgo. Wife of Yes, the same Leonidas of the 300, although his wife deserves her own marble statue for patience alone. Gorgo grew up hearing politics discussed at breakfast. By the time her husband was king, ambassadors and soldiers alike sought her advice. There's a small but famous exchange. When a foreign woman asked her why Spartan women were the only ones who ruled their men, she answered, "Because we are the only women who give birth to real men." A bit self-congratulatory, sure, but it summed up the national mood. Gorgo's wit wasn't just for effect. She reportedly helped decode military messages and lobbied for alliances before Thermopylae. While other Greek queens embroidered myths, she interpreted them. For an outsider, Spartan public life looked upside down. Women rode horses through streets, managed athletic training for girls, and attended festivals bare-armed and loud. To the rest of Greece, it seemed scandalous. But Sparta's stability depended on them being exactly that bold. The men's world and the women's world were parallel but complementary propaganda pieces, both engineered to maintain the military machine. Men conquered abroad. Women maintained morale at home. In a weird way, both were soldiers, just in different uniforms. And because education for girls was physical and mental, women could quote poetry, calculate estate yields, and even debate philosophy. Aristotle quietly admitted they were dangerously smart grave influence. Without discipline, he called it. Translation: these women argue too well. Let's drift toward how these women raised their own children. A Spartan mother did not do lullabies or bedtime stories about gentle nymphs. Her version of parenting advice: come back with your shield, or on it. You can almost hear the steady, monotone calm behind it. Not cruel, not angry, just factual. If her son died in war, she couldn't cry too publicly. Funeral processions for fallen soldiers were quiet and dignified, overseen by women who wore pride as thickly as mourning. To express grief hysterically was disgraceful. To show courage was divine. In that sense, motherhood in Sparta was more like managing a sacred performance, one that lasted generations. But don't mistake all this steel for joylessness. Festivals filled their calendars, celebrations of music, fertility, and athletic contests involving both genders. Women danced in choruses, sometimes mocking men who lost battles, sometimes praising heroes. They wore simple tunics belted high, hair unpinned, moving with the kind of freedom that made foreign poets blush in verse. The Gymnopedia. Sparta's Great Festival of Naked Youth. Yes, that was the real name. Offered stages packed with boys and girls, performing together, chanting songs of valor and teasing. It wasn't erotic, it was ritualistic pride, a rehearsal for strength. Watching from the side, mothers, sisters, and widows carried equal reverence. To stand tall, silent, and observant was their applause. Yet even this system, showing such balance, carried a quiet cruelty. Not everyone was Gorgo. Not every woman owned land or influence. Many, especially the poor, lived shadowed by the same state ideology that empowered others. Their freedoms existed because their lives were state property. For every noblewoman with estates, there were helot women, enslaved laborers who tilled fields and bore uncounted children, feeding the engine of Spartan's superiority. A Spartan woman's liberty stood, literally, on other women's exhaustion. It was the political logic of contradiction. Equality for the chosen few, silence for the rest. As time passed, this system began to wobble. Wealth concentrated in female hands as men kept dying in endless wars. By the 4th century BC, critics complained that Spartan women were luxurious, their estates sprawling while the city weakened. The military that once worshipped austerity now survived on its error. Plutarch wrote that when Theban soldiers finally defeated Sparta, the victors found delicate embroideries and luxury goods in women's quarters. Whether that was true or propaganda hardly matters. The myth of strict iron women had started to crack. Even Gorgo's legendary line became ironic. Sparta's real men were gone, but their women remained, running empty estates, surrounded by ghosts of discipline. By the Hellenistic era, Sparta faded from its old strength, but its women's reputation lingered. they became shorthand for frankness and fearless speech. Greek playwrights used them as punchlines, philosophers as moral examples, Rome as a cautionary tale. Centuries later, Renaissance scholars still copied their sayings in moral notebook proof that confidence had become folklore. If you're picturing them in some romantic light, don't. They were products of a system that valued efficiency over empathy, strength over softness. But inside that logic, something unique survived. Recognition. Their state saw them, trained them, relied on them. For ancient women, that alone was revolutionary. Tonight's travel ends with the image of a Spartan woman standing at her courtyard gate, watching the hills fade in crimson dust. Somewhere in those hills, her sons are training, her husband is marching, and she, unflinching, is calculating harvest schedules. History will forget her name, but remember her backbone. And while Athens wrote poetry, she kept the country alive. Welcome back. Take a slow breath. Let the room get quiet again. We're crossing out of Sparta now, still shadows on marble floors. Still the smell of sweat, honey, and iron butt. This time we're looking at how everyone else reacted, because while Spartan women were busy running estates and raising warriors, the rest of Greece was staring equal parts, horrified and jealous. And when ancient men felt confused, they did what all insecure writers do. They turned their confusion into judgment. Start with Athens. The Athenians wrote plays about practically everything: love, war, politics, even plumbing jokes, but Sparta was their favorite frenemy. To them, Spartan women were the cautionary tale that explained why humans shouldn't experiment with equality. Comic poets like Aristophanes loved the trope of the asterisk laconic lady. Asterisk, he painted her as brash, loud, unladylike, someone who'd yell across a banquet table or tell jokes meant for men. To Athenian audiences, it was scandalous comedy. To Spartan women, it was Tuesday. Then came the philosophers. Aristotle, always neat with opinions, decided Sparta's failure as a state could be blamed on its women. According to him, they were too free, too rich, and too vocal. They had a lack of obedience that unbalanced the constitution. He said this while living in a city where men owned people, so the irony writes itself. Other thinkers, like Xenophon, were more observant. He admired their training and discipline, seeing in them a strange logic. If the entire purpose of Sparta was defense, then women were as much soldiers as anyone with a shield. He didn't like it, but he understood it alf approbo, half anthropological. Foreign travelers usually confused admiration with gossip. By the Hellenistic era, stories about Spartan girls multiplied like campfire rumors. They were said to wrestle men, chase lovers in open daylight, and speak in riddles of wit. Romans later repeated those tales, partly to amuse themselves, partly to romanticize a Greece long gone. What began as political design soon became theater. Spartan women transformed into mythic figures, symbolizing honesty, courage, and a brand of independence centuries before the word existed. Let's glide toward the private myths. Ancient stories claim some Spartan girls, when courted, tested their suitors with riddles or races. A man unfit to keep pace wasn't worth marrying. Others were said to deliver cutting one-liners that outlived dynasties. When a foreign woman asked one why they wore revealing garments, she supposedly replied, "So that our virtues may be seen." That's how self-confidence looked in an age terrified of it. Another legend tells of a mother asked why Spartan women were the only ones able to speak among men. She shrugged. "Because we are the only ones who have something to say." History didn't record her name, but the quote, "won immortality." As centuries passed, the real Sparta shriveled, but the ghost of its women expanded. Roman authors like Plutarch collected their sayings, treating each line like philosophical scripture. He grouped them under headings: sayings of Spartan women, turning casual remarks into moral lessons. They read like haikus of discipline. Do not ask how many, only where they are. One mother reportedly told envoys about her army. Whether literal or invented, those lines became moral currency across empires. By the time Christianity took root, Sparta felt mythical half-history, half-bedtime fable about the dangers of strength. The Church Fathers later used Spartan women as examples of pagan pride, teaching that too much independence led to moral ruin. So even when their city vanished, the women remained endlessly repurposed as symbols of whatever morality the next century preferred. Let's float back to Greece itself for a moment. Centuries after Sparta's fall, travelers wandering its ruins found little more than scattered stones and wild grass. Yet, even 10 guidebooks mentioned the women who once governed men. Tourists may have stood on that dust, picturing ghostly figures running across fields, fearless and barefoot. Time had turned propaganda into legend, the strongest spell history knows. So, what were they really like? Somewhere between myth and bone lies the answer. Archaeologists find traces, jewelry, inscriptions, child burials, remnants of homes that hinted wealth and autonomy. No diaries survive, but each artifact hums the same silent note: order, endurance, pride. Their voices reach us through others' pens. Warped, yet unmistakable. You can sense a personality style: direct, disciplined, serene. When faced with loss, they didn't melt down. They became sculpture. That stoicism entered global imagination, centuries later reborn in everything from Roman matrons to modern cinema's warrior queens. The attitude of walk tall, hide pain has ancient roots in small, sun-baked courtyards where girls first learned to run. If you listen carefully, the modern obsession with resilience echoes their training mantras. Every motivational slogan about strength through struggle might trace its genetic line back to those girls who learned to bear silence as armor. They didn't just shape Spartan men, they shaped what later ages romanticized as toughness. When fitness influencers post quotes about discipline, they're unknowingly quoting Sparta with better lighting. Let's wander briefly into the moral paradox. Sparta gave women physical freedom, but not faith in choice. It celebrated strength, but suppressed individuality. Their bodies were tools for the state, their words propaganda in sandals. Freedom exercised inside a cage still counts as captivity, just painted wider. And yet, that structured dignity left fingerprints all over Western culture. Every debate about whether strong women destabilize societies is, somehow, a faint echo of Aristotle complaining from his porch. Sparta disappeared, but the argument never did. By the late Roman era, the site of Sparta had become tourist curiosity. Writers described old Spartan women performing rituals. No one remembered the purpose of lighting lamps for forgotten gods. It was both eerie and poetic. Centuries gone, still keeping watch. You can picture an aging woman, hair silver, sword long rusted, whispering hymns to a deity no one believes in, while travelers stare and jot notes. She doesn't flinch. She's done that her whole life. As we end this part, think of those women not as anomalies, but as prototypes. Everything that shocked their contemporaries' education, physical training, direct speech, became normal elsewhere. Millennia later, what was once scandal became civilization's default. Not bad for a society that never let its women vote. The air in Sparta changed long before the records stopped. The clang of shields softened, the courtyards grew quieter, and the songs that once thundered with pride became echoes carried by wind. The city that lived for war began to die of peace. The men were gone, buried under campaigns that outlasted their victories. What remained were women surrounded by skeletons of houses, tending fields that had once fed soldiers. The same hands that lifted babies now lifted accounting tablets, counting debts no one would repay. Their strength had turned into stillness. For centuries, the system had worked brutal, efficient, unquestioned. But when enemies stopped attacking and the state stopped growing, the gears jammed. Training girls for a world of constant battle made little sense when there were no battles left to fight. Yet Sparta didn't know how to stop. Young women still trained, still raced, still sang of heroes who would never return. Their muscles remembered what the city forgot. They carried on the movements like religious gestures, keeping rhythm with ghosts. Wealth shifted. Those same women, through inheritance and widowhood, became landowners beyond counting. They built houses with painted walls, filled them with traded goods from places Sparta used to despise. The daughters of soldiers became patrons of poetry, owners of workshops, merchants of olive oil. Their ancestors had raced under an open sky. They now bartered under stone columns. Freedom turned into comfort. Comfort turned into gossip. And gossip, as always, invited judgment. Aristotle's complaint about luxurious women finally came true only because Sparta itself had forgotten how to be poor. There are stories of aging matriarchs sitting on terraces, telling grandchildren about men who never feared death. The children listened politely, staring at a valley filled with farmers, not fighters. The pride had become bedtime history. For outsiders, Sparta was already legend, its discipline frozen in memory, its harsh simplicity diluted by trade and diplomacy. Tourists bought souvenirs from the ruins, asking questions the locals couldn't answer anymore. A city built on silence had nothing left to say. Late chronicles described the women still walking tall, still trained, still speaking with that clipped confidence. But their voices echoed through quiet markets instead of military parades. "They keep their heads high," wrote a Roman visitor, "as if the world still depended on them." Maybe it did, in some invisible way. Even as the empire absorbed them, they kept the habits: minimalism, posture, pride. Sparta disappeared from maps, but you could find its ghosts anywhere. Women refused to shrink. By the 3rd century after Christ, Sparta was a small provincial town. No barracks thunder, no estate inspections, no ahe. But in festivals, some families still reenacted old dances: girls racing barefoot through dust, chanting fragments of songs older than language. The melody had changed, but the rhythm lingered. One fragment that survived simply said, "We run so our children will remember." Every historian reads that line differently. Some call it nostalgia. Others call it defiance. Maybe it's both. Because the truth is, Sparta never really ended. It just seeped quietly into the rest of use every time. Strength is praised every time discipline is sold as virtue. Every time someone mistakes endurance for happiness. Those girls live on, recycled across generations, shaping ideals their city couldn't sustain. They were never free, but they looked like it. They never ruled, but they seemed to. And in that illusion, they achieved a kind of immortality no empire could erase. The torch burns lower now. Stone turns cold. Sparta sleeps for good this time, leaving behind its strange daughters, half warriors, half memories, still jogging across eternity, still whispering through the dust. The story doesn't end with ruins. It keeps breathing quietly, like wind brushing over stone. Whenever strength is admired without softness, a little piece of Sparta rises again. And most people don't even notice it. The Spartan woman survives as an idea, not in temples or textbooks, but in the small instincts people still inherit: discipline, silence, precision. The ghost of a girl who once sprinted across sunlit dirt is hiding in every modern sentence that starts with "be strong." When later civilizations looked back, they couldn't decide whether to worship or warn. The Romans admired them and copied their methods in secret. Their matrons exercised, educated their daughters, recited those old Spartan sayings at dinner as if they were scripture. They didn't know half of them were probably jokes, but legends rarely come with punchlines. The early Christian world treated them like cautionary tales. Women too sure of themselves, too visible, too proud. Preachers loved to quote them when explaining why humility was holy and confidence was a sin. Nothing threatens authority quite like a woman who doesn't ask permission to exist. Centuries later, Renaissance scholars rediscovered Sparta again. They printed the sayings, painted murals of chaste heroines, and wrote moral essays about female moderation, while secretly envying the audacity of those lost women. By the 18th century, Spartan mothers became a political metaphor. Revolutionary writers in France used them to argue for patriotism and maternal virtue. The same symbols that once terrified ancient philosophers now inspired modern ones. It's strange how women stripped of power became shorthand for it. Sparta died, but its daughters became everyone's language for discipline. Today, their image floats through fitness culture, speeches, movies, and 1,000 motivational posters. A line once taught by state officials, "Come back with your shield, or on it," is now a slogan printed on gym walls. It lost its blood, but kept its rhythm. Even the smallest peek at pop culture reveals traces of those old streets: the calm stare, the unbowed spine, the quiet certainties. are the recycled shapes of those long-forgotten girls. But if we slow down, if we look beneath all the noise, there's something gentler to find. Behind every story of strength is a girl who was just doing what she was told. Behind every proud saying is a voice that never had the chance to imagine another life. Their power wasn't chosen. It was trained, engineered, disciplined into existence. And yet, somewhere in that design, something real grew. They took what little control they had and turned it into character. They learned to laugh softly at fear, to stand among men without apology, to find beauty in usefulness. That's the true paradox of Sparta, an unfree people who looked freer than anyone else. Maybe that's why we can't forget them. They remind us that control and courage sometimes look identical from a distance. If you ever visit the ruins, there's almost nothing left. A few scattered stones, the river Eurotas sliding quietly through weeds, the faint outline of training grounds. Yet the silence feels weighted, as if generations of footsteps are still circling. It's easy to picture them there barefoot, laughing in the sun, unbothered by eternity. For once, history leaves them alone. No marble statues, no grand tombs, just an invisible endurance. They outlasted their men, their kings, and even the city that built them. That might be the most Spartan ending possible. So, what remains? A lesson that isn't moral, only human. Strength built without tenderness crumbles, discipline without joy empties itself, and pride without mercy becomes ash. Sparta taught all three lessons to the world, one generation at a time. But for all their extremes, the women of Sparta lived lives that forced history to look twice. They were neither victims nor villains, just people who played their parts so completely that centuries mistook the performance for perfection. The stars above that valley are the same ones they once watched after training. They probably whispered the same prayers humanity still does. For safety, for honor, for meaning. History dresses those prayers differently, but the heartbeat is the same. They wanted to be remembered. And somehow, they were. Maybe not by name, but by posture, by silence, by the strange, quiet pride that still moves through us, like a ghost of disciplined laughter. So, if ever you find yourself walking under night skies, wondering where courage hides, remember the girls of Sparta. They're still running somewhere, their footsteps fading softly into history's long, slow hush. Now we're drifting east into the echoing marble corridors of Ottoman Palace, where candlelight glowed on gold tiles and gossip traveled faster than messages. Our story is the Ottoman Harem, not the fantasy painting version drenched in perfume and cliches, but the real, organized, political labyrinth that quietly ran an empire. It wasn't about romance, it was about control. And underneath the embroidery and etiquette sat a ranking system so strict it made modern office politics look merciful. So let's settle in. Forget the shouting sultans and sword fights. This is the quiet part of the story, the world behind latticed windows, where whispers shape dynasties, and one wrong sentence could shorten your lifespan dramatically at first glance. The harem was exactly what outsiders imagined. Dozens of women living within palace walls, but call it what it really was, a royal institution designed to manage bloodlines, loyalty, and luxury in one seamless human puzzle. Every girl inside ranked somewhere, and every rank meant a different destiny. Think of it as the empire's most exclusive ladder. Only the rungs were lined with silk and flattery. The lowest step was the Adalic, the simple servant girl, usually captured, gifted, or purchased through the slave markets that fueled court life. She learned house etiquette, song, and Selen skills remarkably useful in a room full of spies. If she showed talent or beauty, she could move up to Gedikli, a trained attendant. That meant better rooms, better clothes, and slightly fewer chances of being yelled at by someone wearing diamonds. Above them sat the translated loosely as favorites. They were the women who had caught the Sultan's attention, even once. One conversation, one dance, one faint smile across a courtyard could pull a girl out of anonymity. If the Sultan invited her again, she might rise to Kadin, a recognized consort. The titles blended affection with administration, each Kadin receiving staff, jewelry allowances, and jealous side eyes from everyone below her. At the top of the pyramid sat the Haseki Sultan, the chief consort, often the mother of the heir, and for a long stretch of history, that position held more political weight than most grand viziers. Because where swords ended, motherly influence began. Contrary to Western rumor, most harem women weren't lounging or dancing for eternity. They were learning languages, mathematics, poetry, embroidery, and most importantly, palace diplomacy. The goal was survival with elegance. Imagine years of refining your smile until it communicated loyalty, intelligence, and mild boredom simultaneously. Every movement was a strategy. A misplaced glance could mean exile to the old palace, which, despite the name, wasn't a retirement home, just social purgatory with fewer Let's float further inside now. Picture corridors without men, guarded by the silent figures of the eunuchs, the empire's most secretive officials. There were two main divisions. The black eunuchs, brought mostly from Africa, who oversaw the harem gates, and the white eunuchs, often from Europe or Central Asia, who ran general palace administration. The head of it all was the chief black eunuch, the Kislerak, answerable only to the Sultan and, sometimes, not even to him. This man controlled letters, arranged meetings, manipulated alliances. His signature could elevate a concubine to queenhood or erase her from the chronicles entirely. He was the silent hinge between two worlds, the male bureaucracy and the female empire within marble walls. And, strangely enough, many of these eunuchs became scholars, diplomats, and patrons of architecture. Their names rarely appear in grand battles, but their handwriting changed fates. Inside, life revolved around rhythm. Morning lessons, midday prayers, evenings shaded by incense and low voices. No clock struck louder than gossip. A favorite lost favor for reasons no one said aloud. A new arrival gained a poem from the Sultan and became everyone's problem. Small competitions masked dangerous ambition. And yet, amid all that tension, a kind of sisterhood grew, not warm exactly, but functional. Older women taught younger ones how to read poetry, how to bow, how to stay invisible at exactly the right moments. The Yusta, or senior attendants, maintained order. They were part mentor, part warden. If you wanted to survive, you listened to your Yusta. At the very center of this quiet universe lived someone rarely seen but always felt. The valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She didn't just supervise, she ruled. Her apartments stood above the rest, quite literally a floor higher. Letters, petitions, and court reports filtered through her rooms before reaching the Sultan's hands. She managed the finances of the harem, decided which concubines advanced, and sometimes negotiated with foreign ambassadors herself through secret channels. Of course, she also decided which rival would retire early. If the empire was a ship, the Sultan steered it publicly. The valid adjusted the sails quietly. For the women below, the ultimate goal was not romance, it was motherhood. Bearing a son could elevate a concubine's rank overnight. Bearing the right son could grant her near immortality. Because only mothers of potential sultans lived within the inner circle, called the Khazade chambers. There, the stakes were higher than ever. Your child's behavior, education, even handwriting could secure your position or end it. And every other woman in the harem knew it. The irony here is that the harem's greatest power didn't rest with women who were in love, but with mothers who played politics like chess. The valid Sultan perfected that game over and over again. Her word could redirect armies, arrange marriages of state, or fund mosques that still stand today. Outsiders saw mystery. Insiders saw spreadsheets. Let's pause a moment. Somewhere between the bronze doors and the faint sound of zithers, there's a kind of eerie calm to it all. Women living entire lives inside gold cages, shaping history through whispers rather than wars. The stillness wasn't peace, it was theater. Each smile rehearsed, each silence measured, and the hierarchy kept everything spinning perfectly enough to fool the world outside. The candles burn lower. Now, the halls of Topkapi are quiet, but not empty. Somewhere behind a carved wooden screen, decisions are being made, decisions that will move armies, crown princes, and rewrite dynasties, and the person making them isn't the sultan. It's his mother. The valid sultan was more than a royal parent. She was the empire's invisible prime minister, the calm eye inside 40 years of storms. Her title simply meant Queen Mother, but her jurisdiction covered almost everything. Money, marriage alliances, succession, and sometimes the sultan's mood swings. She had earned that position one chess move at a time, surviving childbirth, political rivals, and the suspicious scrutiny of ministers who feared her more than any foreign army. If anyone doubted what a woman in silk could do, the palace kept a list. Names like Hafsa, Nurbanu, Keksem, and Turhanich carved into marble as quietly as any decree. Let's start with Hafsa, the first valid of an imperial golden age. She guided her son, Suleiman the Magnificent, through early reign with the restraint of someone who'd mastered patience. Hafsa built mosques, funded hospitals, mediated between viziers. No flattery, no scandal, just efficiency. Her power was subtle, her reputation spotless. She was the calm before the famous storm of the next generation. Enter Harem Sultan. History paints her dramatically. Legends make her sound like a sorceress. She began as Roxolana, a slave girl from Ruthenapel, skinned, red-haired, sharp-eyed. When she entered Suleiman's court, the odds were nothing short of impossible. The hierarchy she faced was ancient, crowded, unbendable. But clever people know that rules often have doors hidden inside them. Hurrem found the hinges. She became Suleiman's favorite, then his confidant, then almost unthinkably an Ottoman custom's legal wife. Marriage to a sultan hadn't happened in centuries. Concubines gave heirs, not vows. By doing so, Harem redrew the blueprint entirely. She secured her children's legitimacy, cornered palace politics, and built a charitable empire of her own. Mosques, schools, baths, fountains, her name spreading through the empire under the silky disguise of pious generosity. Meanwhile, rival women quietly vanished. Her main opponent, Mahidevran, was exiled to Bursa, along with her son, Prince Mustafa. And when Mustafa later died under accusations of treason, the whisper stuck to Harem even centuries after her death. Whether she orchestrated it or not hardly matters. Her legends said she did, and legends often win over facts. She transformed the valid role into something the empire had never seen: a female power center with its own treasury, clientele, and foreign correspondence. Venetian ambassadors wrote about her influence with the same trembling admiration they used for generals. After Hurrem, the harem never closed its doors to ambition again. The women who followed learned quickly: study accounts, fund buildings, keep allies, pray often, smile rarely. By the 17th century, Vala sultans were practically governing during the reigns of boy kings and distracted heirs. It was called the Sultanate of Women, a phrase invented by later historians trying to explain how the empire kept functioning while its emperors took up poetry instead of policy. Keksem Sultan became its emblem. Brought from Bosnia, she entered the palace in her teens, rose to be favorite of Ahmadai, and eventually ruled as valid for decades under her sons and grandsons. Keksem wasn't glamorous. She was steel wrapped in lace. She introduced new allowances for soldiers, mediated rebellions, and used charity to keep her image saintly. But her influence created tension at court, divided between old ministers and new maternal rule. Plots brewed. One night, she was strangled in her chambers by executioners loyal to her rival, Tirhan, the mother of the new boy sultan. Both women had once shared lullabies. Now they shared history's strangest irony. Empires defended by mothers who killed to save their children's crowns. Turhan followed Kesem's pattern but refined it. Where Keksem built webs of loyalty, Turhan organized the entire palace finance system, paid debts, and commissioned the Yeni Mosque in Istanbul, a symbol of her authority carved permanently into stone. By then, no one questioned that a valid sultan could rule. The men simply worked around her and pretended it was their idea. Inside the harem, this transformation trickled downward. The patriarchal ladder still stood, but the air changed. Girls training under the new order didn't just learn poetry and dance. They studied politics disguised as etiquette, how to read a sultan's letter, how to assess which court faction was winning, how to praise a rival, convincingly enough that no one saw the sarcasm. They were apprentices in statecraft, wrapped in perfume. Outsiders, especially European envoys, couldn't believe it. To them, power meant loud voices in council chambers. They missed the subtler version happening behind lattice screens where tea served a little colder or correspondence returned a little late could mark a policy change. The Valid Sultan didn't need armies. She had access. She saw the Sultan when no one else could. She whispered advice between meals, and those whispers became decrees. Yet there was a cost. Those same chambers that guarded influence also caged emotion. To maintain respect, these women learned to erase visible grief, anger, or desire. Even joy had to look dignified. A single childish slip could become rumor, and rumor was poison. Loneliness lingered behind the mosaics. Power without freedom feels quieter, heavier. Letters from exiled princesses speak of longing for sea wind, for voices unfiltered by protocol. The empire was immense, but life inside its heart could fit in the palm of a hand. Still, the serenity held. Each evening, servants laid carpets along the marble corridors, eunuchs extinguished the lamps, one by one, and silence folded over the harem, like a careful promise. Tomorrow, politics would continue as usual, measured, polite, scented with rosewater. No armies, no banners, just a mother, a pen, and a whisper. And somehow, that was enough to keep one of the world's largest empires running. The night stretches over Istanbul, and the palace exhales. Somewhere between the call to prayer and the flicker of lanterns, the harem begins its private rhythm. This is the quiet middle of the empire, neither war nor politics, just the hum of routines that kept everything balanced. Inside those golden gates, power looked domestic. Behind the embroidery and rituals lived real women, arranged in a system that blurred comfort and captivity. Let's wander through their world one last time, softly, before the story closes. Mornings began long before dawn. Servants moved silently through shadowed halls, lighting small dishes of oil. Girls woke to faint harp notes, or the measured footsteps of eunuchs checking attendance. Every task was performed in silence, because noise belonged to the outside world. Bathing came first. The famous asterisk, hammam asterisk. More sanctuary than scrub room, steam-filled marble chambers, while attendants carried silver bowls, pouring warm water mixed with rose petals. Cleanliness was both practical and ceremonial. It wasn't just for skin, but for spirit, and the gossip there was cleaner than most court intrigue. After the baths came lessons, music, calligraphy, languages, recitations of poetry. Everyone learned Arabic verses. The words curled on the page like jewelry. A few older tutors taught arithmetic, history, and the art of correspondence. Knowing how to write politely could preserve your life longer than beauty ever would. Midday brought the palace garden hour. Girls walked under cypresses in slow pairs, always supervised. Peacocks wandered freely. Fountains whispered over tiles. The air smelled of citrus blossoms and ink. No one spoke loudly. You could spend 10 years there and never hear a person shout. When sultans were in residence, messengers hurried past the gates, delivering folded notes tied with silk. A raised eyebrow from a senior attendant meant news: someone promoted, someone exiled, someone remembered. Life inside never stood still. It shifted invisibly, like sand rearranging underwater. Meals were small ceremonies. Silver trays of rice, lamb, sherbet, and fruit. Always too much, because appearance mattered more than appetite. You ate formally, even when starving, because grace was safer than hunger. Afterward, musicians played the oud, voices lilting like smoke. Some practiced miniature painting, teeny brushstrokes, capturing gardens that no one else would ever see. By evening, corridors filled with the faintest perfume of amber. The chief eunuch read letters under lamplight, delivering select updates to the valid sultan. Girls retreated into quiet easings of silk and sighs, wrapping themselves in stories older than conquest. But beyond their composure, emotions hid like uninvited guests. Homesickness, jealousy, fear, all smoothed into obedience. Many of these women came from distant places: Crimea, the Caucasus, Albania, Circassian, from families in childhood. Those who rose high rarely dared look backward. Nostalgia was weakness. Instead, they learned to belong nowhere completely, which is its own kind of strength. Friendships formed carefully. Two young attendants might exchange small gifts: a comb, a token, a poem, copied in secret. Their whispers were safer than correspondence. And yet, to survive, everyone learned the art of selective loyalty. Today's ally could be tomorrow's rival. Still, amid so much control, existed glimmers of real-life: birthdays of the valid, spring festivals, and the Mevlid celebration for a prince's first tooth. Laughter returned during those hours, soft but genuine. A stray cat wandered through the courtyard and was pampered into superstition. The Turks said cats carried luck, and the harem needed plenty. Sometimes, late at night, someone sang quietly from her room. The melody floated through half-closed windows and ended before dawn, as if embarrassed by its own freedom. Beyond the walls, the empire expanded and contracted, indifferent yet connected. Inside, time slowed an eternal rehearsal for perfection. Each woman's dream was simple but distant: a son, a respectable exile, a charitable legacy. Some achieved it, others simply aged transparently until the palace forgot their names. History remembers the titles Aseki Balide, but behind every polished title was another nameless girl staring at the garden moon, wondering whether freedom was still waiting out there or had turned into myth. Toward the final centuries, the structures softened. Western diplomats entered politely. Newspapers arrived slyly, and the power once feared now became nostalgic theater. Harems shrank, palaces modernized, and the empire folded into republic. Curtains that once hid empires now gathered dust in museums. Yet the traces remain in recipes, songs, idioms, even apartment designs that echo those hidden courtyards. The harem didn't vanish. It dissolved into memory, a place where silence held more authority than orders, and grace was a survival skill learned young. So as the lamps dim, picture the final moments of an ordinary evening at Topkapi. The garden sinks into silver dusk, the last prayer call fades, and the women retreat to their chambers. Some pray, some dream, some simply stare at the ceiling, listening to the sea outside. Far away, the Bosphorus glitters under moonlight, carrying the city's breath. Within those walls, the empire turns in its sleep, guarded not by armies, but by the steady quiet of women who learned how to rule without moving. Now we're following one of history's most well-traveled voices, Marco Polo. A man who spent 24 years wandering the known and unknown world, wrote about it, and somehow convinced half of Europe that China was real. It's a story of deserts and palaces, of merchants disguised as diplomats, and diplomats pretending to be merchants. But relaxed or not, galloping across Asia at high speed tonight, we're just floating backward, letting the centuries unfold like the slow pages of a travel diary written in fading ink. Marco Polo was born in 1254 in Venice, that confusingly beautiful lagoon city that smelled of salt, spices, and politics. Venice wasn't a cozy hometown. It was a floating business empire, with boats instead of backyards. The Polos were part of the merchant class, those restless people who kept Europe stocked with silk, sugar, and gossip. His father, Niccolo, and uncle, Maffeo, were already professional wanderers. By the time Marco was old enough to complain about homework, his elders were halfway to the Black Sea trading jewels for stories. They reached Constantinople, where Byzantine mosaics met Venetian ambition, then kept going east, because apparently retirement wasn't a concept in the 13th century. Back in Venice, Marco's childhood was quieter. His mother died early, and the city raised him the way ports usually raise children, surrounded by voices in 15 languages and the smell of money that belonged to someone else. He was educated, fluent in Latin, fluent in deals, and probably fluent in arguing prices before breakfast. By 1269, when Marco was around 15, his father and uncle finally sailed home after 9 years away to end, tired and casually announcing that they'd met the Mongol emperor himself, Kublai Khan. Because of course they had imagined being a teenager and hearing your dad say, "Son, we just came back from the other side of the planet. The emperor of everything wants to meet the Pope." No pressure, right? Kublai Khan had sent a request. 100 missionaries and some holy oil from Jerusalem's Church of the Holy the Polos promised they'd deliver. So, a few years later, with letters from the Pope and an energy level that can only come from optimism, the three Polos father, uncle, son packed up for one of the most absurd road trips in human history. Their luggage list probably read something like gemstones, trade contracts, and unearned confidence. The route began through the Middle East, crossing Armenia and Persia. The desert didn't care that they came from Venice. Sand ignores status. Marco wrote later that the heat felt like living inside a kill. He described scorpions, mirage, and the occasional band of well-armed tax collectors who believed in spontaneous fees. Still, he took notes not in a scholar's handwriting, but in a merchant's language. He described the smell of frankincense markets, the way caravans moved like floating cities, and mountains so high fire could not burn upon their peaks. Historians today translate that as he saw snow. But it's prettier his way. Crossing Persia led them into the Pamir Mountains, which Marco called the roof of the world. Thin air, no roads, and a silence that made the sky sound closer. He noted that people there burned. No would Husjakdung and Warlayered felt against cold, so sharp it might have invented sarcasm. Then came Central Asia, where the Mongol postal systems they had won became their lifeline. Relay stations with fresh horses allowed messengers to cover hundreds of miles a day. It was the medieval version of express shipping, except the horses did all the complaining. At one such station, Marco probably wrote his first real travel reflection. How the Mongol Empire, stretching from Hungary to Korea, somehow kept order without modern anything. In his calm, monotone way, A admired it and then listed the taxes, weights, and measurements, because memory and profit were the same thing to him. Eventually they reached the edges of Chinabac, then called Kathi. Kublai Khan's capital, Shandu, shimmered in Marco's notes like something between fairy tale and tax audit. He described pavilions covered in gold leaf, marble floors guarded by lions, and halls where musicians played without repeating a song for months. Did he exaggerate? Definitely. But even stripped of sparkle, there was truth in the marvel. Kublai Khan ruled an empire of efficiency. Markets flowed like rivers, the paper currency system worked, and the roads were safer than most European cities. When Marco met him, the young Venetian must have seemed both foreign and useful, a curious outsider who could calculate profits and tell stories. Kublai loved collecting cultures. Marco became another rare import. For 16 years, he served the Khan on various messenger, observer, because who says a teenager can't run errands across 5,000 miles? He traveled through Yunnan, Beijing, and the southern provinces, documenting everything. Salt mines, porcelain production, even crocodiles mistaken for dragons. When he saw rhinos for the first time, he called them unicorns, because nothing ruins a good story like accurate zoology. But behind the wonder, he kept admiring order. Where Venice juggled chaos for profit, China ran on structure, administration, law, and a quiet that felt almost miraculous. Marco eventually served as a tax official in Yangzhou for about 3 years, according to his account. Imagine explaining that resume line back home, interned with Mongol Empire. Achieved moderate success, collecting salt revenues. He traveled south to the tropics, describing islands of gold and spices that would later tempt European navigators for centuries. Some details blur between observation and dream, which is almost poetic. Long journeys often twist memory into mythology. Still, he noticed small things with calm precision. How people used coal instead of wood, how paper money worked, how bridges arched with mathematical symmetry. These weren't just diary notes. They were messages for Europe about a civilization it could barely imagine existed. By 1292, after decades of service, the Polos prepared to head home. Kublai Khan was aging. The political climate whispered uncertainty. The family cleverly attached themselves to an embassy escorting a Mongol princess to Persia, safer to travel under royal invitation than alone. The return was rougher. Monsatia, tropical sickness, shipwrecks. 2/3 of their 600-person entourage didn't survive. By the time the survivors limped into Venice in 1295, the Polos were unrecognizable, bearded, sunburned, and carrying chests of gems sewn into their clothes. It must have looked suspiciously like a con until they emptied rubies onto the table. Venice forgave them instantly. Life didn't stay hint. 3 years later, Venice went to war with Genoa, its usual rival in maritime. Pettiness, and Marco ended up captured during a naval battle, because apparently his travel luck ran out closer to home. In Genoese prison, he met a writer named Rusticolo da Pisa. With nothing better to do between meals of despair, Marco dictated his travels. Rusticolo, Evre Dramatis, polished it into Il Milione, The Travels of Marco Polo. The partnership birthed a bestseller before printing existed. Europe devoured it. People called him Marco Milione, half kindly, half mockingly, because his stories sounded impossible. Golden palaces, paper money, coal, baths, printed books, fantasy, they said. Centuries later, archaeology quietly confirmed most of it. He lived out his final years back in Venice, respected and occasionally disbelieved, still explaining to skeptics that he hadn't made it all up. When he died in 3024, his last reported words were, "I have not told half of what I saw," which might actually be true and also the most elegant excuse in history for exaggeration. So, tonight, as you drift towards sleep, picture that map in flickering lamplight lines, stretching from Venice's lagoon to the roof of the world, across deserts, rivers, and cities that existed only in whispers. Marco Polo didn't just walk those paths, he translated them into memory. And in doing so, he turned curiosity into currency, leaving behind the quiet proof that adventure can exist without conquest. Play the waves softly in your head, the sound of the ship that carried him home. The ink dries, the candle burns low, and the story closes, still wandering somewhere east of imagination.